In the year 1700, the Indian subcontinent stood as one of the wealthiest regions on earth, known to travelers and merchants as Sone ki Chidiya, the golden bird. This was not merely comparable to Europe's share, it exceeded it. At a time when Britain's economy represented less than 3% of global output, India was an economic superpower that had dominated international trade for centuries. The Mughal Empire, which controlled most of the subcontinent, presided over a sophisticated and flourishing economy. Emperor Aurangzeb's treasury in 1700 collected annual revenues exceeding 100 million British pounds, more than 10 times the income of his contemporary King Louis XIV of France, while governing 17 times the population. Indian textiles, particularly the legendary muslins of Bengal described as woven air for their extraordinary fineness, were coveted from Cairo to Constantinople, from London to Beijing. But within 2 centuries, this economic giant would be reduced to poverty. By 1947, when India finally gained independence, its share of global GDP had collapsed to a mere 3%. What happened during these 200 years represents one of history's most dramatic economic transformations, and one of its greatest injustices. This is the story of how the jewel of the British Empire was systematically stripped of its wealth, its industries, and its prosperity. The story begins not with conquest, but with commerce. In 1600, a group of London merchants established the East India Company with a royal charter granting them exclusive trading rights in Asia. For over a century, this company operated as traders, exchanging European silver and gold for Indian textiles, spices, and luxury goods. The commercial relationship was straightforward. Europe had little that India needed, so European merchants paid in precious metals for Indian products that commanded premium prices across the globe. India's textile industry was the crown jewel of this trade. The cotton fabrics of Gujarat, the silks of Bengal, and the intricate prints of the Coromandel coast were considered the finest in the world. Between 1680 and 1780, Indian cloth was the most traded global textile. The British and Dutch East India Companies imported over 1 million pieces of Indian cloth annually, while the French imported approximately 300,000 pieces each year. Indian weavers were not impoverished artisans. They were skilled professionals who commanded respect and held significant bargaining power in their communities. The transformation from trade to conquest began with the Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757. Robert Clive, leading a small force of approximately 3,000 men for the East India Company, faced the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who commanded 50,000 soldiers. Through bribery and betrayal, particularly the treachery of Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own military commander, Clive secured a decisive victory that would reshape the subcontinent's destiny. The significance of Plassey cannot be overstated. As historian Sir Jadurnath Sarkar observed, on 23 June 1757, the medieval period of India ended and the modern period started. But for India's people, this modern period would be characterized not by progress, but by systematic exploitation. Following Plassey, the East India Company acquired the Diwani, the right to collect land revenues across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765. This marked a fundamental shift in the economic relationship between Britain and India. Rather than trading goods for payment, the company now used tax revenues extracted from Indian peasants to purchase Indian goods for export. India was essentially forced to pay for its own exploitation. This systematic transfer of wealth came to be known as the drain of wealth, a concept that was first articulated by Indian economist Dadabhai Naoroji in 1867. Known as the Grand Old Man of India, Naoroji dedicated his life to documenting and exposing this economic drain. In his seminal work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, published in 1901, he estimated that approximately 1/4 of all revenue raised in India was being drained to Britain. The drain operated through multiple channels. First, there were the home charges, payments India was forced to make to Britain for administrative expenses, pensions for British officials, military costs, and interest on debts that Indians had never agreed to undertake. Second, salaries and profits earned by British officials and merchants in India were remitted to Britain rather than being reinvested locally. Third, Indian raw materials were exported at artificially low prices, while British manufactured goods flooded Indian markets. William Digby, a British writer and social reformer, estimated that between 1870 and 1900 alone, approximately £900 million was transferred from India to Britain. Modern economic historian Utsa Patnaik has calculated that over the entire colonial period, Britain extracted the equivalent of approximately $45 trillion in today's currency from India. This wasn't merely economic decline. It was a deliberate restructuring of India's economy to serve British interests. As Romesh Chunder Dutt, another prominent economist of the era, documented, the annual outflow of goods from India was sufficient to meet the nutritional requirements of 25 million people. This drain was directly responsible for transforming one of the world's wealthiest nations into one of its poorest. Perhaps nowhere was British economic policy more devastating than in the destruction of India's textile industry. For centuries, Indian textiles had clothed the world. Bengal's fine muslins, described by poets as woven wind, were so delicate that entire garments could pass through a finger ring. These fabrics commanded premium prices across Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. The British destruction of this industry was systematic and deliberate. First came the protectionist tariffs. In the early 18th century, Britain enacted the Calico Acts, which prohibited the import of Indian cotton cloth to protect British manufacturers. This eliminated India's primary export market overnight. Meanwhile, British goods were allowed into India with minimal duties, a one-way free trade that benefited only the colonizers. Then came the direct coercion. The East India Company implemented what was called the investment system. Indian weavers were banned from buying raw cotton on the open market and forced to sell only to company agents at artificially depressed prices. Those who refused faced brutal punishment. Historical accounts describe weavers being physically beaten, having their thumbs broken, or being subjected to other forms of torture to ensure compliance. As Britain's Industrial Revolution mechanized textile production, the flow reversed entirely. Raw cotton was now shipped from India to British mills in Manchester and Lancashire, processed into cloth using industrial machinery, and then sold back to India, often to the very communities whose traditional craft had been destroyed. Between 1800 and 1860, textile exports from India fell by 98%, while textile imports from Britain to India surged by over 6,300%. The human cost was incalculable. By 1834, the situation had become so dire that even British Governor-General William Bentinck was moved to acknowledge that the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. Millions of skilled artisans, particularly in Bengal, were reduced from prosperous craftsmen to destitute agricultural laborers. The weaving towns of Murshidabad and Dhaka, once centers of global textile production, collapsed economically. India, once a net exporter of the world's finest fabrics, became a dumping ground for inferior British cloth. The transformation of India's agricultural economy was equally devastating. Before British rule, Indian agriculture operated under various systems that, while not perfect, generally ensured that cultivators retained enough of their produce to survive and maintain the land. The British colonial administration replaced these with revenue systems designed to maximize extraction. In 1793, Lord Cornwallis introduced the permanent settlement in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Under this system, zamindars, who had previously been revenue collectors, were transformed into absolute landowners with European-style property rights. In exchange for a fixed annual payment to the company, zamindars could extract unlimited rent from peasants who actually worked the land. The actual cultivators, who had farmed these lands for generations, were reduced overnight to tenants with no legal rights. The zamindars, many of whom lived in distant cities, employed agents to extract maximum revenue regardless of harvest conditions. If peasants couldn't pay, whether due to drought, flood, or simply excessive demands, they faced eviction, imprisonment, or worse. The British Sunset Law required that if zamindars failed to pay their fixed revenue by sunset on the due date, their lands would be auctioned. The riatuari system, introduced in Madras and Bombay presidencies, eliminated the zamindar intermediary but was equally oppressive. Peasants paid revenue directly to the government, but rates were set so high that cultivators were rarely left with basic sustenance. Tax had to be paid in cash, forcing farmers into the clutches of moneylenders who charged usurious interest rates. When crops failed, peasants still owed their revenue, driving them into perpetual debt bondage. The commercialization of agriculture compounded these problems. Farmers were increasingly pressured to grow cash crops, cotton, indigo, opium, jute, for export rather than food crops for local consumption. This shift, combined with the drain of agricultural surplus to Britain, laid the groundwork for the devastating famines that would claim tens of millions of Indian lives. Among the most brutal manifestations of agricultural exploitation was the forced cultivation of indigo. The blue dye extracted from the indigo plant was in enormous demand in Europe, particularly for textile industries. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps out. All right, let's keep going. British planters in Bengal and Bihar established a system of coerced cultivation that reduced Indian farmers to conditions approaching slavery. Under the notorious Tinkathia system, peasants were compelled to dedicate 3 out of every 20 parts of their land to indigo cultivation. They had no choice in this matter. Planters would force farmers to sign contracts, often through deception or outright violence, and then provide advance loans at exorbitant interest rates that ensured perpetual indebtedness. The indigo had to be sold exclusively to the planter at prices far below market value. Those who resisted faced horrifying consequences. European planters maintained private armies of lathials, men armed with bamboo sticks, who would beat recalcitrant farmers, burn their food crops, seize their cattle, or kidnap family members. The legal system offered no protection. Colonial courts consistently ruled in favor of planters. As one magistrate testified to the Indigo Commission of 1860, not a chest of indigo reached England without being stained with human blood. In 1859, the peasants of Bengal finally rose in revolt. The Neel Bidroha, or Indigo Revolt, spread rapidly across the indigo-growing districts. Farmers refused to plant indigo, attacked planter properties, and burned indigo factories. The revolt received support from zamindars resentful of planter power, the Bengali intelligentsia, and the press. The play, Neel Darpan, Mirror of Indigo, by Dinabandhu Mitra, exposed the horrors of the system and galvanized public opinion both in India and Britain. The revolt succeeded where many others had failed. The British government established an Indigo Commission that documented the system's brutality, and by 1860, indigo cultivation had effectively ended in Bengal. But the planters simply relocated to Bihar, where a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi would later lead the Champaran Satyagraha in 1917 against the same oppressive practices. The development of railways in India is often cited as one of the supposed benefits of British rule. The reality is more complex and considerably darker. The Indian Railway Network, one of the largest in the world, was designed not for Indian development but for colonial extraction. Lord Dalhousie, who proposed the railway system in 1853, was explicit about its purposes: extracting raw materials from India's interior for export to Britain, facilitating the rapid movement of British troops to suppress rebellions, and opening Indian markets to British manufactured goods. The routes themselves reveal these priorities: connecting resource-rich hinterlands to port cities rather than linking Indian population centers to each other. The financing of the railways was equally exploitative. British companies were guaranteed a 5% return on their investments, funded entirely by Indian taxpayers, regardless of whether the railways generated profits. The construction costs were £15,000 per mile, more than comparable railways in Europe and America. The difference enriching British contractors and suppliers. All equipment was imported from Britain, denying Indian manufacturers the opportunity to develop their own industrial capacity. The railway workforce reflected colonial hierarchies. From ticket collectors to station masters, virtually all skilled positions were reserved for white British employees. Indian passengers paid some of the highest ticket rates in the world relative to income, crowded into what were called cattle-class compartments, with wooden benches or no seating at all. Meanwhile, British companies transporting goods paid the lowest freight rates globally. The railways did transform India's economy, but primarily by accelerating the extraction of raw materials and the penetration of British manufactured goods into even the most remote areas. Traditional handicrafts that had survived the initial onslaught of British imports found themselves unable to compete once cheap factory goods could reach every corner of the subcontinent by rail. The Iron Road was, in truth, an instrument of economic subjugation. Perhaps nothing illustrates the human cost of colonial economic policy more starkly than the famines that ravaged British India. While famines had occurred in India before colonial rule, their frequency and severity increased dramatically under British administration. Where pre-colonial India experienced a famine approximately once every 50 years, under British rule, famines struck roughly once every 6 years. Between 1770, when the first Great Bengal famine killed an estimated 10 million people, one-third of the province's population, and 1943, British India experienced dozens of major famines that collectively killed tens of millions. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 alone claimed approximately 5.5 million lives, while the Indian Famine of 1896 to 1902 killed an estimated 6 to 9 million more. These were not natural disasters, they were policy failures. During almost every major famine, India continued to export food grains to Britain. Colonial officials, committed to laissez-faire economic ideology, refused to interfere with market mechanisms even as millions starved. In some cases, relief efforts were actively obstructed. The famine codes developed in the 1880s established procedures for relief, but these were frequently ignored or inadequately implemented when it mattered most. The Bengal famine of 1943 stands as the most documented indictment of colonial policy. Research has conclusively demonstrated that this famine, which killed approximately 3 million people, was not caused by drought. Rainfall that year was actually above normal. Rather, it resulted from wartime policies implemented by Winston Churchill's government. Food was diverted to military purposes, rice imports were blocked, and boats were confiscated to prevent a Japanese invasion, destroying the livelihoods of fishermen and disrupting food distribution. When Indian officials pleaded for relief shipments, Churchill's response was dismissive. He blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits, and reportedly expressed regret only that nationalist leader Mahatma Gandhi had not been among the victims. Ships loaded with Australian wheat passed through the Indian Ocean without stopping, their cargoes destined for stockpiling in Europe rather than saving starving Bengalis. Economic historian Jason Hickel has estimated that during the mortality crisis of 1881 to 1920 alone, India suffered between 50 and 165 million excess deaths, an average of over 1 million additional deaths per year above what would have occurred under normal conditions. These deaths were not inevitable. They were the direct consequence of policies that prioritized British economic interests over Indian lives. The transformation of India's economy under British rule can be measured with devastating clarity. In 1700, India's share of global GDP stood at approximately 24 to 27%, roughly equal to all of Europe combined. By 1870, India's share had fallen to 12%, while Britain's had risen to 9%. By 1947, India's share had collapsed to approximately 3 to 4%. Consider the trajectory of industrial output. In 1750, India produced 25% of the world's manufactured goods. By 1900, this had plummeted to 2%. The United Kingdom's share, meanwhile, rose from less than 3% to over 20% over the same period. India went from being the world's leading manufacturer to an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished goods. Per capita income tells an equally stark story. Economic historian Shireen Musvi estimates that Mughal India's per capita income in the late 16th century was actually higher than that of British India in the early 20th century. While Britain's per capita income grew roughly tenfold between 1700 and 1900, India's remained stagnant or declined. Economist Angus Maddison calculated that from 1850 to 1947, India's GDP per capita grew by merely 16% total, an average of less than 0.2% annually. Life expectancy in India fell by 20% between 1872 and 1921. Extreme poverty, which economic historian Robert Allen estimates affected approximately 23% of the population in 1810, had increased to over 50% by the mid-20th century. At the dawn of the 20th century, the brightest jewel in the British crown had become the poorest major country in the world in terms of per capita income. These are not abstract statistics. They represent hundreds of millions of lives diminished, opportunities foreclosed, and human potential unrealized. The poverty that India inherited at independence in 1947 was not a natural condition. It was manufactured through 2 centuries of systematic extraction. The awareness of economic exploitation became a powerful catalyst for Indian nationalism. The work of Dadabhai Naoroji, Romesh Chunder Dutt, and Mahadev Govind Ranade in documenting the drain of wealth provided an intellectual foundation for the independence movement. Their analysis demonstrated that Indian poverty was not a result of Indian failings, but of deliberate colonial policy. By the late 19th century, economic grievances had become central to political mobilization. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, made economic reform a cornerstone of its demands. The inadequate British response to the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 directly contributed to the founding of this organization by Allan Octavian Hume and William Wedderburn. The Swadeshi movement, launched in 1905 in response to the partition of Bengal, transformed economic awareness into mass action. Indians were urged to boycott British goods and revive indigenous industries. The spinning wheel, the charkha, became a symbol of self-reliance and resistance. Gandhi would later elevate this symbol to the center of the independence movement, making the production and wearing of khadi, homespun cloth, a political statement and an economic act of defiance. The connection between economic exploitation and political subjugation was now undeniable. As Naoroji had argued decades earlier, true prosperity could only come with self-governance. The struggle for independence was fundamentally a struggle for economic justice, for the right of Indians to benefit from the wealth of their own land. The British colonial period in India lasted nearly 200 years. Its economic impact, however, extends far beyond those centuries. The patterns of poverty, the destruction of traditional industries, the agricultural systems designed for extraction rather than development. These legacies shaped India's trajectory long after independence. The zamindari system, though abolished after independence, left patterns of land ownership and rural debt that persist in modified forms today. The industrial capacity destroyed in the 19th century took decades to rebuild. The railways, though eventually repurposed for national development, were initially designed for extraction and required substantial reimagining to serve independent India's needs. Research has shown that regions of India that experienced more direct British rule as opposed to indirect rule through princely states, continue to show economic disadvantages today. The destruction of human capital, the skills, traditions, and economic networks built over centuries, created deficits that cannot be easily measured, but whose effects persist across generations. Modern economic estimates suggest that Britain extracted the equivalent of approximately $45 trillion from India over the colonial period. This is not merely historical injustice, it represents compound losses of investment, development, and opportunity that continue to shape global economic inequality. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or demanding impossible reparations. It is about understanding how the modern world economy was constructed, who benefited, and at whose expense. The story of colonial India illuminates the often hidden connections between historical exploitation and present-day inequality. It reminds us that economic systems are not natural phenomena, but human creations shaped by power and capable of being reshaped by justice. India today stands as one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. Its journey from the devastation of colonial rule to its current position represents one of history's great recoveries. But that journey began not in 1947, but centuries earlier, when Indians first began to understand, document, and resist the economic exploitation that had reduced the golden bird to poverty. The jewel of the empire was never freely given. It was extracted through force, policy, and systematic exploitation. Remembering this history honors those who suffered, those who resisted, and those who are still building a future where such exploitation cannot recur. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.